and welcome. Thank you for your interest and for being here with us. I hope you are all well, healthy, and safe in these conditions. This is Enis Özer from RestartLab, and I hope you enjoyed today's session and we'll all have an amazing experience. Before moving on to the session, I want to give you brief information about RestartLab. RestartLab is a cross-industry think tank initiative, as we like to call it. And in RestartLab, we want to question the work concept as we know today. We are exploring alternative organizational models and human-centric working environments within RestartLab. We are looking deep into the dark side of traditional way of working, and we are trying to challenge the status quo. So by doing this, we want to redefine the work concept. We know there are organizations out there that implement self-management practices, achieve to be more human-centric, and where employees are more happy to work. So we believe that sharing their experiences will inspire us too. Today, James Priest will be with us to share his experiences, and we'll talk about Sociocracy with James. James is one of the co-founders of Sociocracy 3.0 and shortly S3, and he helps individuals and organizations to become more collaborative, productive, and adaptive through S3. After James' presentation, we'll have some time to talk about your questions. So during the session, please share your questions via Slido that we'll be sharing the link in the chat section. Welcome, James. We are happy to have you here, and I'm now leaving the word to you. Oh, we can't hear you.
There we go. Better. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, Enis, and also for the introduction to what you folks are doing with RestartLab. I feel a lot of resonance with that. I'm joining you from Barcelona, so it's early evening time here. I think many of us are on a similar time frame. Summer's finally come here after a very long spring, and now I'm actually quite hot standing here talking to you. I was intending tonight to keep the call quite open and relaxed. I would like there to be a lot of opportunity for some of you to jump in as well. If you had no objection and you would enjoy to have your camera on, then you're very welcome to. It gives me the experience of being with people, which is a more rare experience these days, generally speaking. But also if you're busy, I don't know, cooking food for kids or walking in the forest or something, then of course, please keep your camera off. Before I get into the call today, I wanted to understand a little bit from just a few of you, what motivated you to join this call this evening, or whatever time of day it is for you right now? Why, in all the things you could possibly do for this next hour, you would decide to be here? What motivated you to come? And is there any kind of outcome that you would enjoy from the call that would have made this time worthwhile? So why are you here, and or what outcome would you enjoy that makes this time worthwhile? And please don't be shy. And even if you are, jump in anyway. I'd love to hear from a few of you briefly why you're here. Anybody to start us off? I'll give you a few more moments and then I'm going to randomly select people instead. Let's see. Okay, Kore, I'm sorry if I destroy your name, but Kore, could you share briefly why you're here?
No problem. I just seen in the LinkedIn, and I want to learn about what is the sociocracy, and it's a new term for me. I don't know anything about it. That's the new thing, and now I want to learn.
Okay. Great, thank you. That's helpful for me already. Okay, let's hear from a couple of others. What brought you here today? If you have a different reason for coming to Kore, or what would make this a worthwhile way to spend this hour of time.
By the way, there is a comment in the comment section saying that there must be a better way to work within organizations.
I think there's probably many better ways to do many things, right? But certainly, yeah, there must be better ways to work within organizations. On that note, I think what touched me about your introduction, Ines, is the fact that as human beings, there's so much potential, actually. I think we've achieved such a miraculous set of outcomes in the world, and for all of the challenges and the pain and the terrible things we do to each other and with each other, we've also achieved such amazing things as well. And I can only marvel at the potential of what could be possible. But the question is, can we and will we, and how do we go about achieving our fuller potential together? So maybe we can have that as a bit of a foundational question in the call this evening, and we can perhaps go into that in more detail later. So let me hear from one other person. Why are you here? And you're welcome, if you're a bit shy to speak up, then you can also write it in the chat as well. But what motivated you to come, or outcomes you would like? Bora said here, I'm an engineer and sociology student, also a co-founder in a startup, and a friend of mine tells me this meeting and I want to attend. So welcome, Bora. Anybody else?
Perhaps I might add something, James.
Burak.
I think, as you mentioned, lots of us want better workplaces, organizations to work with, or purposes, etc. But I think most of us don't know how to do it, how to realize it. So I am dealing with some frameworks like Holacracy, Sociocracy, etc., or Semco way, others. So also, I don't think that there is one size fits all approach in this organizational development. So I think I should know a lot of details about all of these trends and find a way to lead my own company or give consultancy to the others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Burak. Yeah. Well, that gives me a pretty good launch pad, actually, into offering some kind of introduction to Sociocracy 3.0. So how about I do that for a few minutes? We see where we go. And then at some point, I'm going to pause and see whether there's any reflections or questions coming up for you so far. And we will dedicate at least half of this call to questions. So I'll try to avoid speaking at you too much. But this phrase, no one size fits all solutions, this has been a growing realization for me over the years. I never imagined that I would end up working with organizations and working around human collaboration in general, but I did have a perpetual fascination with relationships, and especially how it was so possible to kind of enjoy relationships and also to make such terrible mistakes and for them to be so challenging and difficult as well. So my inquiry into conflict and the potential of transforming conflict into creative opportunities to learn and grow led me towards sociocracy, which I discovered about 20 years ago. And I became quite an advocate for something called the Sociocratic Circle method, which some of you might have heard of. It's got some similarities to Holacracy, and Brian Robertson, who developed Holacracy, was very much inspired by that. It was basically a methodology for governance. It was developed by someone called Gerard Endenberg, who took the ideas of Auguste Comte from the 1850s around sociocracy as a form of government that was more scientific and empirical in its approach, and transformed that into a methodology that he developed within an engineering company, electrical engineering company in the Netherlands from the 70s. And basically what Gerard suggested was he took a traditional organizational hierarchy. He introduced something called double linking, which was where any team of people would select a representative who would participate in the next higher level of the hierarchy in the governance decision-making of that team. So, for example, if you're my manager and I was selected as a representative from an operational team then I would come and hang out with you and the other managers in the management meetings where governance decisions were being made and participate as an equal member of that team in the governance decision making. I wasn't a manager, but I just rocked up for the governance. So this idea of double linking and shifting from managed teams to self-governing teams where people take responsibility for governance within their own domains were two of the contributions that Endenburg brought with this experiment, the Sociocratic circle method. He also, partly frustrated by and partly inspired by consensus decision-making and some early experiences he'd had around Quaker meeting practices. Quakers were this obscure Christian sect who were heavily persecuted over the recent centuries because in a way they were like they represented the birth of consensus decision-making into the world. And they had this, what many considered to be a heretical idea that the light was within everybody, or you could say that there was a bit of God within everybody. And as a Christian denomination, this was a way that they made sense somehow of themselves and the world. And of course, this challenged a more traditional interpretation of Christianity with the idea of God as some kind of external deity that you bow to. And it kind of overlaps a little bit with Comte's thinking in the 1850s. He saw the limitations of a more feudal command and control way of governing people and thought that we needed to become more scientific, but also that it was important that people had a sense of kind of ownership and participation, influence in government. What Endenburg developed was something called consent decision-making, which some of you might have come across. And what was interesting about the idea of consent was that instead of trying to arrive at agreement, which is approximately the way people approach consensus decision-making, instead, consent invited checking for arguments why something wasn't good enough or safe enough. This has similarities to holacracy with integrative decision-making, but whereas holacracy has a kind of set of rules about what qualifies as an objection, consent in a way was more simple and in a way a bit more difficult to qualify. It was basically the idea that if someone could present an argument for why proceeding in a particular way would lead to consequences that would be better to avoid, or if someone could present an argument that would demonstrate worthwhile ways to improve things, then that was an argument worth hearing. And I think that idea really inspired me when I first came across it in 2001, because I don't know about you, but as I get older and more experienced, I realize I know less. Life looks more and more complicated, and the things I thought I understood previously, I realize more and more I understand less and less. And that's the nature of complexity, and also part of the nature of becoming hopefully a little wiser in life, that we realize that, you know, the world is an extremely complex place to be. And these days with exponential tech and global communication infrastructure and so on, then it becomes even more complex. And part of the reason we learned to cooperate and we evolved to cooperate from the beginning was because navigating the complexities of life is easier to do with others than it is to do alone. And in fact, the world we live in today would just not be possible were we not have learned very sophisticated ways to cooperate together and to learn together and to benefit from the distributed intelligence that lies spread among many of us. And when we can bring that together, then we can harness more collective intelligence and reap the benefits of that. So consent decision-making was interesting because I don't know about you, but you know, certainly some of us here in the call would have been educated as children and maybe in the wider culture to not object, you know, like you need to toe the line, you need to agree, you shouldn't be too obstructive, you shouldn't stand in the way of things too much, you know. And some of us learned that objecting was an unsafe thing to do. But what Gerard Endenburg said is, hey, no, let's turn that around. If somebody thinks they see a reason why something's not good enough, let's create a culture where people speak up, where they bring that perspective. We can check whether or not that argument is sound. And if it is, we're going to learn something valuable. We're going to learn information that can help us to improve. So going back to the Sociocratic circle method briefly, then we had shifting from managed teams to self-governing teams called circles. We had double linking. So in a typical hierarchy, you've got representation or flow of influence from top to bottom. And Endenberg introduced influence from bottom to top as well. You could call it creating bottomarchy to counterbalance hierarchy and flow information and influence both ways. We had consent decision-making. And the final thing that Endenberg suggested was that we could use consent decision-making as a way to select people to take responsibility for domains within the organization on the strength of the reason. And again, I find this really interesting because he was observing the fact that if we select people on the strength of the argument for somebody to take responsibility for a specific area of work within the organization, and we check for any objections from everybody, including the person who's been nominated for this, then we'll end up with people, one, who are in a position in the organization for whatever period of time, with the support of people around them, with no objections, as a part of a kind of logical process of considering whom would be appropriate to have in that role. And also the fact that the person themselves was choosing to be there, and that they had no objection to being there either. And so these days, as organizations get more complex and there's a growing need for kind of talent, let's say, and experience, alongside that, we also need engagement. And so this idea of selecting people into roles really helped to move people around according to the experience they had, the interests they had, so that the organization was continuously adapting to use the wisdom and experience and skills distributed among those people in the most effective way. So I'm laying that out because if you know Holacracy, you'll see some similarities with elements of Holacracy: lead link, rep link, organizing in circles, integrative decision-making, selection process, very much the same. Holacracy is much more than just a governance method, and that's where the story ends for the Sociocratic circle method. Brian Robertson, who developed Holacracy, wanted to create a system where, one, it had tools for operational side of an organization as well, not just governance, but also Brian was very interested in looking at how to reposition power in an organization so that power to influence was used in service of the purpose of the organization itself, right? And that couldn't be co-opted in service of individuals. Whether or not Holacracy actually achieves that effectively is another question, but that was a major part of his intention. He said it's really helpful if people in an organization are in service of the purpose of the organization itself. And this has really given birth to a lot of conversations around purposeful organizations over the last few years. And I think the thing that's most relevant for me around that is just meaning, because when something is meaningful to us, then we feel motivated and inspired to make the extra effort to get up on those days when otherwise we would rather just stay in bed, and find the energy to persist when things get challenging, because we believe in what it is that we're invested in. We believe in something that's beyond just ourselves somehow. And I think Sociocracy and Holacracy have the potential to facilitate environments where people are located within the organization in places where they want to be and where they have energy to contribute and where their contribution really counts. So that's a little bit of history around like Sociocracy and coming toward the current day. And I'm going to just give you a very brief kind of elevator pitch around what S3 is. And then I'm going to stop for a minute and I want to see if there's any reflections so far or any questions from you. So the question, what is Sociocracy 3.0, is not an easy question to answer in an elevator pitch, and it's not an easy question to answer in an hour's call either. But one way to look at it, and we can look at it from many different angles, is to think of it as a menu of human behavior patterns that emerged in human collaboration over time, and they evolved and prevailed because of their usefulness in certain contexts. Okay, so S3 is, from one perspective, a menu of behavior patterns, processes, guidelines that, if you look back historically at the behavior of our ancestors, you can see these different practices emerging and different perspectives that led to certain guidelines. And they stayed around because they were useful in the field of people cooperating and collaborating together. And what sets S3 aside from things like the Sociocratic circle method, or from holacracy, or from SAFE, for example, scaling agile framework, any kind of framework or methodology, is that we developed S3 by cherry picking specific patterns that we could see woven into methods and frameworks like holacracy, like the Sociocratic circle method, like Scrum, like SAFE, and so on. And we took a lot of ideas from agile and lean thinking and from interpretations of sociocracy and broke that down into component parts. The reason being that, going back to your comment at the start, Burak, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. And so while I've seen a framework like holacracy celebrated and used almost by the book in some organizational contexts, I've also seen many cases where people choose something different, or they choose holacracy and many aspects don't work for them, so they discard different bits and pieces and they synergize them with things they already know. Not always that turns out well, but what's good and appropriate versus what people do are two different things. The same with the Sociocratic circle method. There's very few examples of organizations that just run by the book, the Sociocratic circle method. And even if they started with an interest in that, over time, they do what people do, which is take what works, adjust things that don't, synergize them with everything else they know, and throw away things that they think don't work. So Sociocracy 3.0 was our endeavor to break things down into pieces. And instead of selling a framework that people should use, instead, if we sell anything, it's the idea to pay attention to the situations you face and to identify areas of need in your organization where your current approach fails to bring about results you would expect or wish to see. And having identified prioritized areas of needs of the organization where you're looking for other options, then S3 provides some options to consider, among many others in the world, perhaps, that you might pull in to help you better respond to these particular needs. So it's supporting an iterative and incremental approach to change on the basis of a prioritized backlog of challenges and opportunities you face in the organization, and supports this more kind of iterative, emergent approach to organizational development rather than a whole system implementation of some kind of framework or methodology where at worst it doesn't turn out helpful at all, or at least you end up throwing many babies out with the bathwater. So let me stop there for a minute. You've had a history lesson, a bit of a segue into S3 and a high-level overview of what that is. But what's happening for you around this so far? Are there reflections and or questions so far on what I've shared? And I think we have some questions here already, don't we? In the
yeah, we have some
Slido here.
In the Slido,
yeah.
So
let's have a look at those.
Since no one's talking, let's have a look at them.
Great. Okay. Well, so we've got the possibility to upvote things if you would like. That's an interesting concept, by the way. Majority decision making, many people are familiar with. So while I'm just taking in these questions and inviting you just to see if there's any that you particularly would enjoy me to dive into next, you can just add a like there. One thing that's interesting about consent decision making is shifting supremacy from people to argument. So again, this goes back to Comp's idea of a more empirical way of making and evolving agreements. Let's say empirical and reasonable. So in majority decision-making, supremacy lies with the majority. But if you answer the question, where does wisdom usually emerge first into a system? New wisdom, does it emerge through the majority first or through the minority first? Well, typically, you know, somebody who realizes that maybe the earth goes around the sun and not that the sun goes around the earth is usually, you know, a bit on the fringe to start with, and they might even be persecuted for such a crazy idea. Consent decision-making is seeking out dissent and seeking out the potentially minority point of view, because oftentimes there's wisdom in that niche perspective that somehow challenges the majority. So nonetheless, we can use dot voting and like these questions. So let's take Burak's at the top there. Should the decision systems be designed for never being blocked or bad possibilities, or should we start with trust? Burak, could you just explain that a little bit more, what you mean by that, please?
Sure. I'm constantly thinking about decision models in organizations like consent, consensus, etc. But sometimes I feel that I get into the trap of being afraid of blocking the whole system. So I start to think about different policies about not blocking the system, and then it goes and goes and becomes a PMI book size. So I think there should be a balance between the frameworks, decision frameworks, and the how can I say, anxiety of being used badly. So what do you think about it?
Yeah, I get it. Okay, well, for those of you familiar with holacracy, you know, Brian Robertson became frustrated with his understanding of consent decision-making and how that applied. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of people took the idea of consent into a context where there was a very strong aspiration towards creating more pluralistic environments. You know, it's a very kind of egalitarian field where people are trying not to stand on top of each other. They're trying to respect one another, trying to create equal opportunities and so on. And one of the problems with that is that we're not equal as people for many reasons, right? And a key principle of S3 is not equality, it's equivalence. And equivalence is about ensuring that people who are affected by decisions have the power to influence those decisions on the basis of a reason for doing so, on the basis of an argued objection that demonstrates how proceeding in a certain way could or would lead to consequences you want to avoid, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve things, right? So understanding that and learning how to qualify arguments as objections is a skill set that we're not really taught in school, right? So, you know, it's not like you go to learning how to argue lessons on a weekly basis, right? Generally, it's a little bit opposite to that in schooling, unless you're privileged to go to a kind of private school or some kind of more elite environment where they teach people to debate and to question and to challenge and to do all of those things. So one mechanism, Burak, for avoiding getting bottlenecked is a clear definition of what qualifies as an objection. Another problem, though, that these more egalitarian groups face was the wish to try to include everybody in everything. You know, because if you have a principle like equivalence and it says, well, anyone affected by decisions can make or influence those decisions on the basis of a reason to do so, then some decisions in a company of 100,000 people are going to affect all 100,000 people. So what do? You kind of book a big kind of hotel somewhere, you know, and you all come together in a room. That's not going to be effective at all. So you have to take this from a bigger perspective. And I like to look at, and maybe this ties into a little bit how organizations benefit from sociocracy practices, the second question we can come to. But in my opinion, what makes sense in all cases in organizations is anytime we're making a decision is to ask the question, how can we free people up as much as possible to be able to create value for themselves, right? So if you follow that principle, right, then you're making decisions that give people maximal autonomy to be able to get on with whatever it is that they're there to do. And what does that predicate on? Well, firstly, it predicates on people being clear approximately on their areas of responsibility. I don't mean nailing everything down into like very specific details, because if we're freeing people up to create value, then we want the minimal necessary constraints possible to maximally enable people to create value. So by doing that, we're reducing to the minimum dependencies. And like, for example, like dependency on a decision-making hierarchy. By the time you get a green light on a decision, opportunities might be well past if you're dependent on going up a ladder for getting permission from somewhere and then coming back down the ladder and so on. So it makes sense to try to enable people as much as possible to be free, but with freedom comes responsibility. So it also makes sense to clarify responsibilities. And this was one of the, over recent years since Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations, I think people got very excited about the idea, yay, we can kind of remove management and we can take down all the walls and finally we're going to evolve into a teal organization and we're all going to be free and it's all just going to kind of magically happen, and what happened was chaos happened and power didn't go away, right? Power in systems needs to be channeled in a way that's healthy. And if it's not, then it's going to flow in ways that are unhealthy. So by having a conversation about power to influence and getting clear on how to distribute power to influence through a system, AKA who can influence where with what, and adding over the top of that, a higher level possibility that if anybody sees activities or proposals coming up that somehow represent the potential for consequences you'd rather avoid or ways to improve, then you can, while people are free to get on with things, you've got enough transparency that anyone anywhere can raise possible objections if they see problems with how things are going. And not because they want to be a pain in the ass, but doing it because they might be the only person so far who realized that actually it looks like the earth does go around the sun. It's not the other way around, And so they're bringing that new wisdom into the system. So to summarize, Burak, you need to have clarity on what you mean by an objection, what qualifies as an objection. In integrative decision-making and holacracy, you have a checklist. It's very strict and very tight, okay? And if there's a problem that falls outside of that, then the can is kicked down the road. It creates a new tension and then you pick it up in the next step. In S3, we've got a very strict definition of what qualifies as an objection. And you can think about that individually, but in a collaborative context, there's also a pattern called test arguments qualify as objections, which is a way where you kind of apply the concept of objection to arguments presented as possible objections themselves. What I mean by that is, let's say, Burak, I've proposed something and you raise a possible objection. Just because you say it's a possible objection doesn't mean it is yet. And what we can do is we can check with everybody here in the room, hey, does anybody disagree with Burak's argument qualifying as an objection against James's proposal? And if they do, we can consider that argument. And then we can check if anyone disagrees with that argument and so on. So we're going through a process of refining arguments to arrive as best we can, according to the collective intelligence available, to see whether there's any kind of weight that qualifies as an objection in that original argument at all. Okay. So firstly, don't get together with other people to make and evolve agreements unless you absolutely need to. Yep. Either because you've got dependencies or because it's complex and you want to harness distributed intelligence, or it's a really complicated situation, you want to bring together different expertise and so on. But if you do come together, then invest in understanding what qualifies as an objection, right? In what case can people step in and block forward movement in some way? And the most sensible way I've discovered to determine that is by checking whether the argument reveals a way to improve that's worthwhile or not. Yeah, there's a gray area in there. You can't use the cold, steely knife of rationalism in all cases. You know, there's arguments people can present that have a lot of the person in the argument. So you still need to negotiate those areas to a point, but by using distributed intelligence, using the perspective of many, you can take a much more nuanced, granular, high-resolution view on things and determine if there's value in people's arguments at all. That was quite a long answer to your question, Burak, but did it cover it well enough for you?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. So how about I move on to this next question then? How do organizations benefit from sociocracy practices? Do they blend sociocracy with other approaches as well? So firstly, and this is my thing, I think it's just important to be clear on the difference between sociocracy, lowercase s, as a form of government conceived of by Comte. Okay, so think democracy, rule by the demos, rule by those with voting privilege. Sociocracy, rule by the social group. This was Comte's concept for a future form of governance for states. The Sociocratic circle method, developed by Gerard Endenberg from the 70s, a methodology, circles, double linking, decisions by consent, select people to roles on the strength of the argument. And then Sociocracy 3.0, menu of patterns that pull patterns from sociocracy, but also from many frameworks and methods connected to agile and lean as well, developed by Bernard Bockelbrink, myself, and Lily David since 2015. So with that said, that little added history element, oh, I've lost the question here. Where did it go? Did anyone else lose sight of that question that I was about to answer, or was it just me? Well, I think it was something like, which, oh, I'm sorry, I forget the first part of the question. I remember the second part was about whether sociocracy can be mixed with other patterns as well, but can someone remind me what the first part of the question was? It seems to have disappeared. Hey, there we go. How do organizations benefit from sociocracy practice? Thank you very much. Well, maybe firstly, it's helpful to recognize that S3 patterns only make sense if your current approach is not good enough to bring about the results you expect or wish to see. Okay, so if everything seems fine and you're happy, there's no tension and everything kind of seems good enough as it is, then Sociocracy 3.0 patterns aren't really going to be very helpful for you. And even if they were, you wouldn't know because you wouldn't try them, because as far as you're concerned, everything is fine as it is, right? So firstly, an organization or individuals within the organization need to be confronted by some kind of challenge somehow, that their current approach fails to respond to effectively enough. In that case, there are many patterns from S3 that can help. We've categorized them, it's a bit of an arbitrary categorization, but into clusters, things like patterns for organizing work, many of which are familiar if you're working in a kind of agile context, like visualize work, prioritize backlog, limit work in progress, pull system for change rather than pushing work, pulling in work, and so on. Patterns for building organizations, again, really familiar, many of these to you, like role, different types of team. I mentioned circle as a self-governing team, but there are teams with different properties as well, linking, double linking, these kinds of things. Different patterns for structuring organizations. So holacracy and Sociocratic circle method, they have a double linked hierarchy. That was the only structure for organizations. But if you look at organizations in the world today, there's many ways that they structure. And so we've endeavored in S3 to document some other ways in which organizations structure as well. You had Emmanuel recently talking about Rendan-Hay and, you know, shifting power to influence. That's a great example. Free people up to create value for themselves as much as possible. shift power to influence to the periphery of the system as far as you can, reduce the gap as much as possible between those creating and providing value and the beneficiaries of that, aka the customer, and identify dependencies and put in place the minimal necessary structure to be able to handle those dependencies and support the ecosystem as a whole, right? It's a really great example of a way you can put together an organization to optimize the flow of information, to optimize how you distribute power to influence in the system, to free people up to create value as much as possible. So this is a big way that organizations can benefit from patterns from S3, because it just helps to eliminate waste. It helps to reconfigure things. Patterns for decision-making, really useful. Many people struggle with decision-making despite the best intentions. And a big part of the reason for that is we come together with a very different history and habitual ways of making and evolving agreements with other people. And we also see the world in very different ways. So unless we've got a sophisticated enough approach to deal with different perspectives, then when we come together, we can end up kind of clashing or polarizing on ideas instead of transcending that more kind of binary perspective and embracing a more both and point of view. And this is something that consent decision making really helps with, because it's, you know, the Quakers, going back to that early influence from the Quakers and Gerard Endenburg, was this idea of the light within. They built an entire meeting practice around this that's prevailed over a few hundred years. And the way that they do their governance, the way they make agreements that will govern future decisions and actions within the organization, is by coming together and creating a space where they clarify the why, they clarify the situation they're seeking to address. And then they sit quietly and they wait for somebody who feels moved to say something. And they're not fighting about who's right. They're not lobbying for whose idea should be the one that wins. Instead, what they do is they kind of speak their stories to the center of the circle, a bit like indigenous culture have a very similar approach. And they're listening for the meta-narrative. They're listening for the story of stories. They're looking for the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So they kind of have this emergent approach to synergistic decision-making, harnessing distributed intelligence, if we take a non-religious perspective on it, and weaving that together into a both and more solution. And if you add to that, bring in some of the agile thinking around iterative and incremental development, it's not that they're trying to come up with a final solution. They're coming up with a good enough next step that they can apply, get real world experience from the consequences of it, and then learn from those experiences to continuously adapt and improve based on learning over time. So this is another benefit of the Sociocratic circle method, Holacracy, you could argue, and also S3, is that it's helping to bring this agile mindset, this idea of iterative and incremental development, to governance as well as operations. It's not just about agile approach to product and service development, but it's an agile approach to making and evolving agreements within the organization as well. And I think that's really relevant today, because the thing about complexity is there's so many different agents interacting with one another that will inevitably lead primarily to consequences you can't predict or anticipate. And when you interact with a complex system, that leads to even more unintended consequences that you couldn't have anticipated. And sometimes you're lucky whether an intervention leads to anything useful at all. So this idea of taking a more kind of good enough, safe enough approach, jump in somewhere and see the consequences of your actions and learn and evolve as you go, helps an organization to take a much more emergent approach in the face of complexity and evolve everything, not just agreements about products and services or about working processes and so on, but about the organizational structure, about how power to influence is distributed, so that that whole system becomes dynamic and is constantly able to adapt and change through the activities of the people throughout that organization to continuously adapt to meet the diversity of challenges that individuals face and the organization as a whole. So more agile, resilient organizational system, a more engaging organization, because if people have more power to influence, let's back up there. Your recruitment is really important, right? Because ideally you want people jumping into the organization who feel inspired and motivated and want to be there. You know, it's like, I love my job. You know, that's the kind of energy you want, right? And even when it's really, really hard, you know, and you're challenged by something like a global pandemic, then people still get up in the morning and say, I'm going there because it's meaningful for me, you know, and I want to be there and I'm going to do it and we're going to do it together, you know. So creating opportunities for people to really take ownership and to really be in places within the system where they can excel and where they can give their best. All of these are factors that are really beneficial to organizations. And the last part of that question, just so as not to forget it, around can you take S3 patterns to synergize with other things as well? You will. I mean, you know a ton of stuff, right? You've learned many, many tricks and ways to get through life, and many of those will be deeply habituated into your being. So, and they've got you to where you are. And for those of you that I can see, you seem convincingly sane and you look quite respectable and like you're managing quite well in your life. So S3 patterns are there to kind of complement that and enrich that. And absolutely, they should be taken lightly and in synergy with all of the amazing things that you've learned to do on your journey through life so far. Okay. Any reflections on what I'm saying? I know there's questions here, but I'd love to hear something from one or two of you, just to get an idea what's happening in your world as I'm saying these things, and to break the monotony of me speaking for a minute.
We are a group of shy people, I guess, James.
Well, maybe. Yeah, I'm also a bit shy.
I have one question for the consent decision making. I was always curious about, and it's not very clear to me. So, if someone makes an objection, who has the authority or the power to say, yes, we accept this objection, we agree that we qualify this an objection, or say something like, oh, we don't accept this objection because it doesn't qualify as an objection or because of some other reasons? Is this the facilitator? Is this the group? How is that decision made?
Yeah, so, well, I'll try not to confuse you too much, because this is a bit of an abstract process. I endeavored to explain it a few minutes ago, but I'll try it in a different way. So, Ivalo, it's a great question. If you're part of a team and you're considering a proposal, whether that's a proposal that you formed together, and there's a pattern in S3 called proposal forming for collaboratively forming a proposal, or that's a proposal that one member of the team brings to the meeting, then consent decision making is a great way to test whether that proposal is good enough and safe enough or not. And so the question is, in that moment in the process, when you ask people, are there any objections to this proposal, and somebody presents that they believe they have an objection, how do you know whether or not that objection qualifies or not? Okay, so this is where my explanation of what an objection is really important to understand. An objection is an argument that demonstrates how proceeding in this way will, or that it could, lead to consequences we would rather avoid. Right? So there might be a low probability, but we definitely don't want that to happen, even though it's a low probability. Or it might be certain that proceeding in this way will lead to consequences we want to avoid. In either case, you don't want to go ahead without changing that proposal, right? Because there's a problem with it. On the other hand, an argument might say, well, it's kind of okay as it is, but if we were to do this, I'm arguing it would make it even better. So if somebody sees a way to make things better, if somebody sees a way to help everyone have a better day, get more value out of our limited time, energy, and resources, then great. We want to hear that too, right? But the problem is that there are also many opinions about what's better. There's assumptions about things. There's preferences that people have. Oh, I just think it would be nicer pink because I like pink and not blue, So how do you determine that? And one clue in that, Ivalo, is when you're testing arguments qualify as objections, when somebody says, I have an objection, the helpful response is to say, you have a possible objection, right? So when someone presents an argument, we're not accepting it as an objection yet. Just because I say I've got an objection to your proposal doesn't mean to say that is an objection. What I'm really saying is, I have an argument, I've thought things through, and I think this argument would qualify as an objection. And so in the process of testing arguments qualify as objections, having presented my argument, we want to check, one, do people understand the argument? Two, invite people to consider for themselves, do you think this argument qualifies as an objection or not, by the definition I was describing just now? And if you disagree with the argument totally or partly, please raise your hand. Okay, so what we're doing is we're harnessing the perspective of the different stakeholders in the group to check whether anybody has any disagreement with the argument. So let's say, Ivalo, you believe you have a possible objection, or you have a possible objection to my proposal, and we check if anybody disagrees, and Gezin, is it? Gezin says, wait a minute, I think I disagree with Ivalo's argument. It's partly correct, but I think there's a problem with it. So Gezin can share her argument now. And instead of Ivalo and Gezin having a fight about who's right, what we do is we hear Gezin's argument and we check, do people understand Gezin's argument? Think about it. Does anyone disagree that Gezin's argument demonstrates a problem with Ivalo's argument? And if nobody disagrees and everyone agrees with Gezin's argument, then we're going to go back to Ivalo, who also agreed in that case, and we're going to ask him if there's anything left of his argument. Or alternatively, someone might disagree with Gezin's argument. Let's say Tolga disagrees with Gezin's argument. We're going to repeat the process again. It's like a fractal process where we hear the proposal, in this case, a proposed disagreement with an argument. We check people understand. We see whether people think it qualifies as an objection to the original argument. And if they don't, then we kind of go back up the ladder, refining that argument until we get back to the top. If that sounds complicated, it is complicated, right? But decision-making is complicated, and collaborative decision-making is especially complicated because you've not just got people with like clear arguments about why things aren't good enough or how things can be improved, but you've also got all these different opinions about why something would be better one way or another, or doubts and concerns about things that can't be proved, but people are just anxious about it for some reason. And so this process is quite rigorous, but it's not the facilitator who decides, Ivalo. In fact, as a facilitator, I would be the last person to speak up about whether I agree with an argument or not. What I would be looking to do is facilitate that process to invite different perspectives and use the collective intelligence distributed among the group to refine arguments and to learn whether there's an objection there or not. And that process, when you get fluent with that, with a team, is super fast. It's like lightning fast. But there's a learning curve there because, as I said before, we haven't been taught how to do that. We haven't. What are we encouraging here? We're encouraging thinking about things. We're encouraging really taking a moment to look at something closely. We're encouraging disagreement if people have disagreement with one another, but not for like a fight to the death, the fittest survives, but it's more looking at arguments and seeing where's the fit argument. And synergizing different points of view until we arrive at something that's as true as we can determine so far as we know between us for now. You'll find it in the, there's the Sociocracy 30 website. There's also patterns.sociocracy30.org, which is online, the guide online. The objections, the concept objections goes into this in some detail. And we've also got the test arguments qualifiers objections pattern laid out there as well. And over the next couple of months, 2 or 3 months, we should have much more detailed explanations of some of these patterns coming online as well. Yeah. Ines, the time's really flown. We're on 5:56 already. Would you like to jump in and host somehow?
Yeah, thank you for your moderation as well. So you helped me a lot, James. Would you like to answer one more question, because we have a top question there? I know you're not a holacracy expert, but I guess the audience is curious about this because it's rated. Zappos has quite the back away from holacracy. Is holacracy that? Maybe just your opinions about this question.
Yeah. Okay, well, number one, I just put a link in the chat to our online community platform. Just yesterday, I published a conversation there that I had with John Bunch from Zappos. John Bunch was responsible for a lot of the rollout of holacracy in Zappos, along with a colleague of his. I forget her name now, but I don't want to overlook her. But he basically provided holacracy training to about 1,500 people in Zappos over a year or two. So that conversation goes into this topic in quite some detail if you're interested. It's anyway a worthwhile conversation. John's a really wise guy and his experiences are great to hear. My experience talking to people at Zappos isn't that they quietly backed away from holacracy. I don't think that's true. What they did is they went quiet about their practices with holacracy because their decision to implement holacracy attracted a lot of attention in the media, and some of it was used to kind of leverage and put holacracy on a platform, and some of it was used to slice and dice holacracy and take it down. It wasn't a very helpful media coverage for Zappos. But what happened in Zappos with holacracy is much as I was describing at the beginning of the call. People took what worked, they adapted things that didn't, and they dropped things over time that didn't seem relevant to them, and they synergize those things with whatever else they do. And if you look at Zappos today, there are teams that use, you could say they're using much more from holacracy than other teams. And there's some areas where you don't see much evidence of holacracy at all. That's not necessarily all good. There were some things that might have been helpful to retain, but over time, people just kind of developed their own bespoke way of doing things. Is holacracy dead? I hope not. I don't think so. I mean, there are people I speak to who are really happy with holacracy. And if you're in an organization and that's the way you want to go, even though that wouldn't be my choice, it's like, why not? You know, if you think there's a strong enough need and if you think the gains outweigh the costs, then go for it. What's interesting as a development in holacracy recently is Constitution 5.0. So now they're breaking it down into modules, beginning to move towards a more pattern-based iterative approach to implementing holacracy. And it's my personal belief that in many years to come from now, holacracy will break down even more. You know, you'll see it refined even more into patterns. Because I think ultimately, it's not about that's a good way to go. I just think at the end of the day, this is what we do as human beings. You know, we persist with patterns that are useful and the value they bring outweighs the cost of adopting them. And pulling in an individual pattern in response to a specific need, or even a set of patterns in response to a set of needs, is often far less investment of energy than it is to pull in an entire framework into your system as a whole. So, yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you for your, we have reached our time box. So thank you for your contribution and for your time. It was useful and inspiring for us, James. And thank you, all of you, for being here with us.